Yeah, background's really working for you. So
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
happy.
we're live. Uh, and yeah, matching black things to drink out of. Anyway, good to see you. Now we're actually talking to at least some of the internet, so long as
All
our
right.
audio is actually, and the audio looks correctly configured. Uh, so I am going to just give up giving an intro to these conversations. I think the point of this thing is just to expose the world to people who work on Urbit, who are otherwise these faceless sigils who
Sure,
only
sure.
communicate in text.
How it
So
should be.
we can either pick up the thread exactly from where we were chatting last week, or I can try and give it some context. Maybe the brief context. I've been thinking about this thing a lot, where basically like I have realized now post facto that even I didn't honestly was not 100% sure that Urbit would work, probably until maybe 2 years ago. I started to really get
Tell me, can you
fully
can you give me a
flipped.
more specific can you give me a more specific date 2 years ago? Because I have also like a date from roughly two
I think
years ago when I like became convinced it would work.
it was not, so it was like after when we had been in this pattern, right, of like, and this was very much driven by me, where I was like, all right, let's try and build stuff on top of this, because if you can build something and make it reasonably good, then that's like the proof that I need to like fully believe in it, basically. And
Yeah,
we had done that a
yeah.
few times, but honestly, like it just hadn't ever really worked at the level that I wanted it to work. And then even with OS 1 was like the launch of whatever OS 1 now landscape, like was pretty bad. Like it
Hmm.
wasn't, it was rocky. We had scaling problems. We just all kinds of problems. And there were problems
Yep.
with the system itself. And then I think it was in the following 3 months or so where we actually went and fixed, like networking got like 10 times faster. Like we went and fixed a bunch of stuff in the event loop, which actually made day-to-day use of OS
Hmm.
1 like pretty good. And then by the end of that summer, I think OS 1 was like in March or something. And then
Yep.
by the end of that summer, which I guess is 2020,
It's 2020.
uh,
Yep.
yeah, that was like then we were using it, actually using it. Like the whole company was actually using this every single day. This is like the thing that replaced Slack and Discord for us.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I think that's when my like I was like, oh, this is gonna work. Like this will work. Uh,
Yeah. I had the
which,
same.
considering
It
at
was
that point I was like 6 years in or something. I mean, I was like
right.
the whole time I'm like, I'm pretty sure this will work. Like I do think it will work, but I'm not 100% sure. Whereas now I think I've changed. Anyway, go
I
ahead.
would let them in, but I remember pretty exactly when I had the flip, and it was based on exactly the same things you said, which was when I was getting really into the networking. It was specifically May 2022, and I was doing various
2020,
like
I
educate
think.
2020. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
2020, and I was doing various educational things and like some live streams and stuff with other people, and like we were doing them on Twitch, and like it was just very clear that we had to post all our messages in Twitch because like the urban ones were taking like
Oh yeah.
45 seconds to go through if they like
Yeah.
did it all. And so then there was just this like all those, I think the networking and event log improvements happened in June, July, definitely
Yeah.
there was some really big ones in June. And there was just this almost overnight flip where you were like, oh yeah, now chats, messages go through in a second or
Yeah.
two. And we just never went back to using any of those things again. And I specifically wrote some at the time, probably overly bullish piece, now maybe underly bullish, but like about how Urbit's definitely like underly bullish for maybe for the sort of financial community reasons we can talk about later, but
Yeah.
super bullish in the sense that I was like, from a computing perspective, like this is going to work and like we need to
Yeah.
be ready for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that was also it'd be interesting to like maybe we should just call Philip or something, but part of
Mhm.
what made me really enthusiastic at that point was that that was basically all work that Philip did in like, yeah, like solo. And they were
Yep.
very, I mean, he had help on certain parts and so on, but most of the fixes that were really impactful were incredibly simple. Like they were just things that just hadn't yet been worked on. And I think for me,
Yep.
like building software, being someone who like has always been really interested in the history of computing, like there are always different phases of like new of computing platforms, or just like new ideas in computing, right? There's like no amount of money can make this go faster phase, and then there's like
Hmm.
some amount of money can definitely make this go faster. And of
Right.
course that's a gradient, like obviously like industrial scale software today you can just pour money, like rivers of capital flow into it, and it does new things, right? And
Hmm.
I think what I was looking for was like, oh, can you actually get to this point where fixing things in Urbit is a function of the amount of work that you're doing and not a function of just like hard or research problems? That's like, I think that's where like I never had this. I always, having worked on it for such a long time, like I was completely committed to the idea. Like I believe this is the right thing to do, but you just don't
Right.
know like when is it going to shift to, hey, we can just, this is an engineering problem. This is not like a computer science like research problem.
Yep.
And
And
yeah,
there's
that
and
was
most of there's a I mean, we can talk about the roadmap later, but there's like there's enough things that are in that category right now to move the needle substantially for a number of years. Where
yeah.
like, yeah, so I think we're all aware of that. The people doing it are aware of that, and I think like I guess we're almost talking a little bit more about what does that roadmap look like, sort of on just a broader technical business perspective, and then from a financial perspective, given that like we can now throw money at Urbit and have some things get better. How do we
Right.
get like, how do we get that money? How do we get more smart people in? Because now we have things that can like they can just be thrown at.
Right.
Essentially, if we have money and smart people, we can throw them at things and things will get
Yeah.
better. So like, how do we get those things? Is what we're
Right. Yeah.
talking
Well,
about.
that's the thing. Right. So this is the, that's probably, yeah, sufficient context, but that's what we were talking about um, last week. Sorry, I spent time like in the shop yesterday, and so whenever I do that, I'm just like inhaling horrible dust, and the next day I sound like I've been smoking. Um, uh, but yeah, anyway, I think we were. I mean, we've been talking for the last couple of weeks, really, basically about this, like that the narrative around, and these two, like that, that this story from a minute ago is connected, right? It's like all of those early years of Urbit, like I was very skeptical of like building a narrative around Urbit that was too, I don't know, like too, could have the potential to be too sort of viral or be too big because I felt like, look, there are hard problems here that like no amount of money can fix. And I also watched a
Yeah,
lot of our
yeah.
peers like just drown in capital and then look at, and actually, like some have done better than others. I was like more bearish on it a couple of years ago. Now I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe it kind of works. But it felt to me like I just didn't know if we knew exactly how to deploy it. But now that I have the confidence that we as a community and as a project like can actually very effectively deploy capital, should suck in, yeah, like more talent. And there's, I mean, even day to day, it's like there's constantly stuff where we're like, oh man, you could have 20 people working on this. Maybe that's excessive, but you can like ramp up the number of people very
Yeah,
steadily.
yeah.
But the storytelling like has to be updated for sure, and that's like probably the gating problem. I feel like at this particular juncture, or like I mean, it's the thing I've been thinking
Well,
about a
so
lot. That's for
let's
sure.
Yeah, so let's like pick. So I have like two or three threads that we could go down. So one that you were saying we want to just play with verbally was like, the urban roadmap, like what this looks like for the next few years. Another was um, just the idea in general of like sort of how we can Urbit can like sell community and monetize that even
Right?
prior to
Yeah.
have everything fixed technically. And then there's sort of some new stuff that I would put in that category of like thinking how to like plug energy leaks, which I can talk a little bit about, like in the sense of Urbit right now for the last couple of years, probably those 2 years specifically, and especially since like maybe mid 2021, has been generating insane amounts of value within the
Yeah.
network for the people there, both financial, social, career, and we're doing a decent job capturing some of that, but a lot of it's also like sort of like leaking into the cosmos and not filtering back. And so some aspects of like financialization and other things actually have more to do with like correctly capturing energy flows than they do with
Yeah.
like just like pumping to the moon.
Yeah.
Um, and then also this weird topic, well, not weird, but like topic I just hadn't thought of until I was doing a impromptu sort of podcast with Rovness and another guy over the weekend. And the other guy who works as our like writer on Ukbar was saying how we have been doing all this stuff riffing on how you know we want to make programming fun. For programming to be fun, you have to not context switch. You have to operate all within one system. And the thing that makes not programming not fun is when you have to like sort of stitch together things across like a lot of boundaries. And so Robness was correctly saying that the thing that does that and makes programming fun is what you call an operating system.
Yeah.
And like it's not a
Yeah.
coincidence that like pre-networking like Unix was very fun for the people building it. And there anyway, leaving that aside, the other guy on our thing, Mitchell Ritson, our writer, was saying, in light of that, I think the most notable thing to him interacting with Urbit developers specifically was how ridiculously high morale was for like everyone.
Yeah.
These are all people that
Yeah.
are like it's just
Yeah.
morale is sky high. Everyone's like happy all the time and like programming is fun. They
Yeah.
all think they're gonna like solve stuff. Like they're hanging out with like cool people. And I think that's related to both the idea of like NFTs and community and also energy leaks that like there's these
Yeah.
we're generating these insane amounts of like it's like nuclear fusion type like levels
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
energy sources. You're basically getting energy for free. And we could
It's
probably
interesting.
go a long way in terms of attracting people and capital by finding even more ways to capture that, enhance that, get more resources sucked into the vortex
Yeah.
and doing that. But we now have this like really natural energy and morale generating thing for programmers,
Yeah.
which is like a super valuable thing in a world where programmers are like the scarcest, most valuable resource for like
Yeah.
everything.
You see some of
And
it
they're
like
also
with
beaten
just
down.
community too.
hmm hmm
And sorry, go ahead though.
Well, no, and I was just gonna finish by saying that like programmers working in more normie contexts are much more beaten down, even when they're
Yeah.
like highly compensated and working low hours.
Yeah.
They just don't exhibit that level of morale. Like they have
Well,
some of like the
yeah.
best working conditions of workers in human history, but
Yeah.
it's not enough to compensate for programming when it's not fun is very not fun.
Yeah. I mean,
End of Congress.
yeah, it's incredibly not fun. Like it's physically not fun. And I think that
Yeah.
things so that's, I mean, so yeah, these things are all pretty closely related. I like this like framework. It's good. I think that one thing I've been thinking about a lot and wanting to develop a little bit and write about is basically that like I think we've taken a lot of shit over the years for like being weird. And that's true, but Urbit is weird in a very specific way, which is that it's like it's a different category of software, basically. And
hmm
the way I have always thought about it, I think, is that like, yeah, most software is just like industrialized software. It's just like you can think of it like you're like eating at McDonald's every day, or it's the all of the stuff to get you McDonald's level like nutrition, you know,
hmm
which requires this big infrastructure, right? For like everything has to be gigantic because you're servicing so many people, so it's all super industrialized. Whereas Urbit is basically
hmm
like it's one computer, one person. So the system like reflects this idea that it's a simple tool, it's a mechanical device, it belongs to you, and so you got to be able to
Right.
tear it down, put it back together. It's got to last a long time, and everything about like that set of design constraints are just totally different. Like it's a totally different world. And so comparing these two things, this is part of why I think so many people come from, like your average Google engineer like looks at Urbit and they're like, this is stupid. And I'm like, yeah, because it doesn't pattern match to like anything that you've ever seen before. It doesn't obey any of the rules that you know. And like you're just like, I get it. Like it's just weird to you. And
There's
that,
there's an there's a simpler, more like charitable explanation for that, which ends up in the same place, which is like we were saying that like because we don't have any good operating systems in networked
yeah,
environments right now,
yeah,
particularly, and like because like what happens is someone learns to program. Either usually it's like they're almost always either self-taught or they do it in university or they do it in like they learn it for like a job or something. And
yeah,
initially there's like this initial like moment of you're all in one environment. You're writing like sort of what this Google programmer would call toy programs. They're
yeah,
kind of fun to write. You do them, they work. You get this huge high because you're essentially manipulating pure ether into like you're basically taking just nothing and turning it into
yeah,
like real stuff. And then you like make it, and maybe you even make it do like authentication or networking or something. And then as
yeah,
soon as you have to like either distribute it to users, deploy it in a production setting, usually it'll happen. You do your first job and you like do your thing, and then they're like, okay, now we're gonna sit you down into like, haha, you like didn't know that you need to also use like
yeah,
six other tools in order to
yeah,
like actually do authentication. Can you believe this guy tried to roll his own like whatever? And like and like they're not wrong. Like the Google engineer isn't wrong. It's just like everyone who's a professional programmer has had that beaten into them that like you just
yeah.
can't do things in a non-industrial way because everything will break and zombies will like kill you. which is
Yeah, yeah,
true.
which is true. It is true. It's
Like,
totally true. Like, unless you basically like, yeah, like invent a different system for it, and like, I think that people just
unless you actually make a good operating system in a network environment, which turns
right.
out to like take an incredibly like a very long amount of time because it's a really
Yeah,
hard
it's not
problem.
easy. It's a super
Yeah.
hard problem. I mean, I think, but it's a hard, like, it's a problem like that where the answer is just is totally counterintuitive to like this other way of
Hmm.
building software. I think that's like, there's a seed of something here, right, that is like feels like a really important part of the narrative that I think we've like missed. For every Hacker News commenter that just thinks that Urbit is like too weird to ever succeed, there's actually a story there that we're like not telling, is what I'm saying, right? That's basically like, yeah, yeah, it's really weird by these other standards, but you're not seeing it for what it is. Do you know what I'm saying?
I would
Like,
like to, yeah. So I think like, okay. So there are, I need to think of them, but there are other things in life where there's something that looks sort of odd or empirically weird, particularly to like more like autistic types. Um, but like empirically, it works really well.
right,
And I want to like, I mean, I could probably, the examples that come immediately to my head are things like, you know, like cooking or like certain
yeah,
aspects of like
it's interesting.
human interaction relating to like
Yeah,
either like let's say like leading teams or dating or whatever, where the people who are
yeah,
the most successful practitioners tend to be like these like massive empiricists, and if you try to break down what's happening theoretically, it falls apart. But there is like a really strong
right.
logic to it. So in our case, the empirical thing is, look, random, grizzled 41-year-old hacker news guy making $460,000 at Amazon. Like the only thing you can say Urbit looks as weird as you want, but like the empirical thing you cannot argue with is that everyone here is having much more fun than you are.
Yeah, yeah,
Like just
yeah,
and that fun seems to be sustainable. It seems to lead to new levels of like the system being more usable in ways that are even legible to you. It
yeah,
seems to attract other people who aren't like downtrodden losers.
yeah.
Uh, and like, so like I think that
Yeah.
we could probably iterate on this further, but if we're talking about like coming up with talking points here, it's
Well,
we are like really fun.
I mean, you're picking the thread that I would normally pick and have over the years, which is basically like people are like, this is weird. And I'm like, yeah, well, whatever. Like, I know the experience is going to be better. And so the main thing for me has always been like, make that experience like so categorically superior that like that's the thing that basically like, is kind of like changes people's behavior. Like, I don't care about changing people's minds. I care about changing their behavior. Right. And so I
Hmm.
think for me, the obsession has always just been like, look, I know that the day-to-day experience for either a developer or a user using the system is just going to be better. Like people, yes, are going to have more fun. They're going to like
I
just
think
it's
for I think for developers, it like unarguably is already, which is an
probably true.
interesting thing. I think that's
You think that's
you could
really true?
pull.
It's interesting. I guess you're
Yes,
right. It's like we
I
don't
think
and
it's
we don't
extremely true. That was the point that I was hitting with like Vigil
yeah, yeah,
Ritzon's
yeah, I
point about
understand.
like
Yeah.
about everyone having high morale, is that like
Yeah.
it's very clearly
It's
true
interesting.
right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's just interesting because it's those people have high morale once they have. I think of like our biggest problem, like our biggest developer experience problems, just having to do with like the on ramp and like getting people familiar, right? So people who have like just
It's a
because right
short part
now,
of the on ramp. Yeah.
yeah, there's just that initial. It is true that barrier to entry is relatively high and should come down. And I think about that a
Hmm.
lot because I feel like that's the biggest gate to like growing that community. But you're right that
Hmm.
anyone who makes it over that hump, which is not that bad, but it's very
It,
unconventional by
again,
comparison to like
empirically, the numbers of people who are getting over that hump, it's like roughly, I would say, 5 to 10xing per year, which is like if you can maintain
that's
that
true.
growth rate on the developer side, that gets you to big numbers very rapidly.
That's
We'll see
true.
if we can
That is
maintain that.
true. Yeah, we
The,
yeah.
the stuff
Uh,
the stuff you're talking about is probably key to actually maintaining it and figuring out whether you actually 10xed it or if you only just added 100 people. Um,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, difference
right.
between exponential and linear growth is, painful
Never
to
obvious at the
realize.
first glance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, it's not, I mean, I tend to just like, I think I'm like the obsession for me is like the, like in the or like in the things that aren't good yet or something. You know what I mean? Like you're right. I'm like, yeah, maybe actually
Yeah.
I could sustain and could continue to grow, but it feels like there's a lot of potential for growth and fixing this like
I think I'm just like too aware of the finiteness of both like lifespans and also like energy that people can put towards concentrating on things. So whenever something is growing, like predict like sort of consistently in some like especially
yeah,
exponentially in some
yeah.
way, and there's clear paths to doing that, I get a lot less like anal about like a certain part of the experience not being right. And actually my usual just response to people who focus on that is basically you're idiots because you're focusing on the wrong metric.
Maybe so, yeah. Well, we're not. It's not like we're measuring this stuff that closely. I mean, you
Right.
could look at
Well,
like
it's
I'm
like a
like,
mental metric. You're focusing
yeah,
on the wrong like experience qualities, I guess.
yeah. That may be true. That may be true. But it does feel like there's well, anyway, I guess like to your when you say like it feels like we're like already winning like very categorically on developer experience. I like my immediate reaction is just like ah.
How
You
can
know,
that be?
like
How can that be true?
I'm like
Because
that
I
could be
know lots of
so
things
much
that are
better.
bad.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
but you're
the
right
way
that it yeah.
well, the way I see that, and I think the reason for the perspective difference is that A, I agree with you that there's like just any number of things that could be way better. And for me, that just makes me like even more excited and bullish,
Yeah,
because I'm
fair.
like, oh, we have this growth rate. People are like this excited with this product. And there's like very clear paths to making it better in ways that will like get the next like,
Yeah.
circle around it, which this is the thing I always say about product market fit, which is like whenever I always have these weird discussions with people where I'll note that something has clearly found product market fit and they'll
Yeah.
say all the things that's wrong with it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, the fact that it has all those things wrong with it and people are using it is even more evidence of the fact that it has really strong product
Right.
market fit. So Urbit has product market fit for making developers happy and excited again and like
Sure.
feeling joy
Yeah. Okay. That
in
yeah.
ways that can be significantly improved.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, to the prior thought about like it's also ways that can be significantly improved that are relatively easily solved with capital, right? And so if you
Yeah.
look at like what most of the stuff I'm talking about is like, can you provide like a better framework for people to build applications more quickly, that's better documented, that's easier to,
Hmm.
understand, and can you provide better avenues for people to build community around that? Can you like better support those community? There's but like all those things are they're like kind of they're not like off the shelf, but they're like easy to imagine. And so
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's true that the harder problem has been solved, which is maybe like I mean for me it's funny like it may be like a way of working thing. Like I feel like conflict is kind of like a source of energy. So for me to like actually
Mm,
get stuff done, I'm like just fixated on all the things that are broken all the time so that I can like continuously like want to improve them basically. But I mean in this framing,
yeah.
it's funny because I'm like man, Urbit's kind of had product market fit since 2013 in many ways, Um,
Yeah.
like,
I
I
mean,
mean, I
it,
just think
it,
of like the number of people with the metric I used to track was how many people have come to me relatively soon after encountering Urbit and talked to me about dreaming about Urbit in the future. And it's like a
mhm,
lot of people. Like it's like a crazy number of
yeah.
people. It's like maybe, I mean, still in the tens, but that's just like that's
It's
ridiculous. Like,
right.
uh, so anyway, I think you have
Yeah.
I
No,
think you have the
I
right
don't
framework
think
for thinking about like product market
I
fit,
don't think the
basically.
V8 I don't think like the V8 JavaScript engine has that like level of like dream penetration.
That'd be interesting to
At this
find out.
point.
Maybe
Yeah.
sad.
Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm
It's
totally wrong. And like
like,
we just like don't understand the inner life of the Hacker News commenter who's squeezed like those that performance out of his dreams.
yeah, no.
Um, well, so okay, so on that, I mean, I guess the thing is though that there are things that like keep me up at night with regard to Urbit, and they mainly relate to like wondering when we'll ever sort of find the memes or the people to like take advantage of all of the work that the broader crypto community has done for us in terms of like
Yeah,
all the stuff that is our best advantages. I would argue that like everything in the NFT boom of the last year, which like
yeah.
is still going even with these like
Excuse me.
with this market downturn. It like is like ridiculously well suited to Urbit on a couple fronts. One
Hmm.
is that of course that like suddenly what Urbit addresses are is like a ton more legible. It's
Hmm.
extremely legible in an NFT context to say, oh yeah, we're making like a new like universal app protocol operating system, and it has native NFTs of like different tiers, which actually even happen to be like minted in numbers that aren't like sort of group numbers like in tiers that like are very legible, like
Yep.
256, 65,000. These are all within orders of magnitude of useful like threshold, and then like the 4 billion like serving like sort of a different purpose. um
Yep.
and then like the other thing though is that they just have this massive emphasis on using those NFTs to unlock and gate communities.
Yep.
And that's something that's like just so insanely natural to Urbit, but also to a degree how Urbit IDs have been used.
Yep.
Like already that I think Urbit basically invented that NFT use case prior
Yep.
to like it happening, and now it's just a matter of finding ways to like sort of leverage that further. Some
Yep.
of which I don't know. I have like we've talked about it a bit, and I have some strong feelings there, but I do think some of it involves discarding some of the initial ways that like urban address space was thought of, because there's just like empirical results that other ways might be better. Like as an example, if I suggested that it would be a good idea for community onboarding to do things like have high value like urban communities that were specifically like seeded with content, given preferential access to access to like TLON and other projects in various ways, or to like people who will like interact there, and to have those gated by stars or certain sets of stars, I would
Yep.
probably get significant pushback from that, because of the like place that planets are kind of like culturally occupy in
Yep.
orbit. But I also think that it would potentially make a lot of sense and just let us swim with the tide rather than against it. So this is like
Yeah.
the universe of
You
things
might.
where
I think you'll get less pushback than you think. My feeling is that like
okay,
there's um I mean it depends on the design. I think the original lately I've been thinking like we just did if you like from the perspective of NFT world, we just did everything backwards, but maybe that's the advantage, right? Because NFT world is like,
right.
hey, we're going to build this community out of this funny
Mm-hmm.
picture, and then somehow out of the capital we raise from those funny pictures, we're going to build
We're
the
gonna do
infrastructure
some.
for a community. Like, we're gonna do something. I'm not, and
Well, yeah. We're gonna do something and do some project. And Urbit started with the project, which,
right,
of course, if you somehow can make it through the years and like have that, that's a
yeah,
much better starting situation than like having to have it, and also probably has higher quality people. But I think that it's like it's cool that all these other ones uh, have paved the way for that. And there's very clearly something more real to people about participating in, well, in like an urban event like assembly, or like the New York events or stuff like that, or just other things, than there is about IRL NFT community events. Although I will say those also seem to be like my lady and others seem to be having a lot of success with those in ways that I think urban also will,
oh, I
just maybe
think,
not
I
as
mean,
many
it
drugs.
feels, no, the nice thing, it feels totally like I'm like they're exact opposites of one another. Where I'm like, on the NFT side, people have figured out all of these, um, or they're experimenting. I don't know if they've really fully figured it out, but they're experimenting with different, basically, structure ways of structuring like community membership and distributing community membership, like
Right.
just purely around like those mechanics. Like what are those mechanics? What are the mechanics of distribution? How do people identify? And
Mm-hmm.
how do people like um, one thing I was thinking about yesterday is that it's kind of like, there's been this old idea in the sort of decentralized identity space, which I always found a little bit like academic and off in space, but around this idea that you want to let people kind of like create attributes of their identity. And
Mm-hmm.
NFTs kind of like actually just made this possible, right? So it's like if I hold a bunch of different pieces of NFT art, I hold a bunch of different rights to, different communities via collab land like things. I hold a bunch of different, PFP style projects. Like that's exactly that, right? Like here's all these things that I've actually, basically staked in a way, or whatever I've either
And
bought them or staked something.
notably, in terms of like a proof of concept for this, I mean, this is like exactly how a significant part of like the high end art world works. And it's
Yeah.
just being like recreated. Like, so there's a lot of proof of concept that, like, as a community thing, just accumulating different NFTs that demonstrate taste and community probably will work. It probably
Yeah,
will
yeah.
be a durable innovation, as you're for the reasons that you're saying.
Yeah, no, I'm like not so impressed in many cases with like the, sort of aesthetic quality of the work, but it's not really that important. Like
Yeah,
like
no,
that's not the point.
no
It
one's that
doesn't matter.
impressed with like the aesthetic quality of like the work that gates like sort of normal high end art communities. Like that's been declining for a while.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's probably true. I mean, it's mixed, but it also doesn't. It's like
And then
taste
right,
is. It's like the point is that it's per taste is per community in a way, right? Like all like communities always have different ideas of like what's beautiful or what's important. That doesn't matter. But anyway, it seems like there is something interesting going on, which I admittedly was ignoring because I was just busy working on Urbit stuff. But kind of looking more seriously at the NFT world, I'm like, oh, okay, you guys have figured out a lot of the stuff. There's some embedded like some of this stuff already exists in the urban address space, but yet so many of these projects point at, hey, we're going to go build something to actually materialize this community. And I'm like, wait, we're the general case of that. I'm like, if you want to materialize your community, you just materialize it on Urbit. That's what Urbit is
all right.
for.
So
Uh,
I have like two different like forks I want to go down, and they're like fairly different. So I have them written down here now based on what you were just saying, so we can decide which one to do.
yeah,
So,
sure.
choose your own adventure. The first one is like we can talk about Urbit being this like generalized app protocol, which is the only thing that realistically is on the horizon that will let these communities and our community make the kind of like arbitrary general purpose stuff that it wants for its
Hmm.
community members. And like, of course, we've talked about how Urbit should position itself to capture significant amounts of value and accrue it to its native NFT, like in the world where that
Hmm.
happens. The other one, though, that I hadn't thought that one we've talked about, and we could go with it more. The other one I hadn't thought about when you were talking about people sort of just like creating status and personality by collecting different like
Hmm.
NFTs and like associating them with themselves. That lends to in that like app protocol world leads to like a very natural function for Urbit NFTs that we should probably be pitching more, which is like a central hub for having the
Yeah, yeah,
identity that collects all those things. So it shouldn't be that like
yeah.
your sigil is the only NFT art that you ever show and you're like a
Right.
sigil maxi, but it
Yeah.
should be that like if you have like 150 different NFTs that you like created are becoming like sort of that's like a thing for you and you're demonstrating tons of taste in the way that I would when I spent my
Right.
college years just like collecting musical knowledge or something.
Right.
Like you do that with your Urban ID and accrue it to that, and we should be like not only enforcing people doing that, but like building tools that make that very natural, and
Yeah.
also doing these as we've talked about these like kind of different forms of like airdrops to build already made NFT communities that
Right.
like make it a natural thing for them to do that. I think that's
Right.
like a real like a thing I hadn't thought of, but that makes sense in that
Yeah,
context.
yeah. So that's, I mean, so yeah, we haven't talked in a week or something, but that's the thing I've been thinking about over the past week, kind of starting to evolve some of the things we were discussing, which, yeah, you can see, or I mean, you can see it, or maybe I'm not sure if it's obvious to everybody, but yeah, exactly right. Like there is a kind of seed of a product idea there too, right? Which is kind of like, it's almost like is Urbit ID, can you make Urbit ID like the ENS of NFTs, sort of, right? Like,
Yeah, I was just about
um,
to say like ENS is a real competitor in this field. I think we have a huge
yeah,
advantage in that like we actually have an operating system that our thing is native in, and so that'll give it a huge advantage for people wanting to accrue to that. And of
yeah,
course, and we'll probably know we've won when people associate their ENS name with their Urbit and like collect
yeah,
their ENS thing as
yeah.
another ID under their Urbit, which is actually a really interesting thing we should probably push for and that they might be receptive to.
Yeah,
Um,
I thought about
but
this.
like,
The thing with there's a really categorical difference between Urbit ID and ENS, right? Which just has to do with the ownership model. And well, the two things, I guess, actually for me. One of them is the ownership model. The other one is basically user picked names. So like I think user picked names
mm,
for identity is a total fucking anti-pattern. Like you want people to address themselves with actual strong pseudonyms like a phone number, something that doesn't force someone to leak any bits about themselves, even a handle. And you want to let that reference be static.
all of my most valuable urban handles like leak tons of information. I'm the Galaxy like Rus. I have like Tim Look Niptev as my like ID.
Well,
Um,
that's on you, okay?
I
Users can do
specifically
whatever they
chose.
want.
I spent like large amounts of money to leak as much information as possible.
Well,
Um,
that's totally a possibility, but I still think it's not. The problem for me with the user experience of ENS is like the first thing you do
I
is pick the
yeah.
name, right? It's like don't let people pick their names. You can let them pick their name for now, but then the underlying identifier, which shouldn't be just a hash, because that hash is going to rotate as you update your wallet. You need those things to be decoupled.
Right,
It's like a
right.
serious architectural flaw, which I'm not interested in arguing sort of like as such. I'm just like, look, I think it should be this way, and that's why Urban
I
is this way.
I think for what it's worth, I think almost everyone agrees with that, and even the most like grizzled of like HN haters like will acknowledge that the Urbit PKI is like pretty nice, and most of the fears within
Yeah.
like people at TLON are that like someone would just take the Urbit PKI system. So with regard to ENS, I think our explicit stated goal should be to like subsume them as junior vassals, where
Well,
the
you could.
relationship is such that like you associate your Urbit basically takes ownership or association of like an ENS domain that you like really
Right. So
like.
that actually works reasonably well to me because you could say like, okay, like my Urbit ID is Raphael, but I own like Galen.eth, which unfortunately is owned by someone else. I looked this up the other day, although I hadn't even thought
Uh-huh.
about buying it. Uh, um,
I should,
but uh,
yeah.
but then if I decide later that like actually, okay, there's some like historical association between me and this Urbit ID, I'm going to try and break that association and I want to start using, whatever, like
Hmm.
beautiful morning.eth or something like that. And then you can just swap that out, right? And so like you can do this
Right.
thing where, so this is part of what I was thinking about with NFTs as kind of like metadata about yourself, right? It's the same type of thing. It's like you have your Urbit
Yeah.
ID, have a bunch of NFTs that are kind of like meta. It's like my gallery of art that I love, my gallery of like sneakers in the metaverse or whatever bullshit is going
Yeah.
on. Whatever, like they're like these people want to declare about who they are in the digital world. Cool. And then like the root identifier for that is an Urbit ID that like makes
The
generally makes
root
sense to me.
the root identifier and orchestrator. I think we're going to move into a world
Sure.
where I do think that Urbit IDs, especially like sort of the more like let's say rarer ones, like
Yeah.
either galaxy stars or like recognizable planets,
Yeah.
or planets that people make rare by putting a lot of effort into them and getting lucky and their thing
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
memorable enough.
Yeah.
Um, I think like those will remain as there, and then others might be more like people might not remember your Urbit handle, but like all of their programs will remember it, and it'll orchestrate things
Yeah.
clearly,
Yeah.
and it'll be like when you go to a gated event in New York and scan your QR code that proves you have your
Yeah.
Urbit, like that you have this Urbit ID, it'll like pop up the NFT art that you own and things like
Well,
that.
yeah, so this is interesting, not only in case of individuals, but more. So I was also thinking about this in terms of stars and large pieces of infrastructure. So if you start to say, or like move towards this world where like a star is kind of like a core piece of community infrastructure, and it sort of defaults to every planet that it invites, joins its sort of default group, and you move the tooling. It's really like a baby step, honestly, for us at this point, but like towards
Hmm.
when you get this thing, the community that you build around it is sort of engineered more to be like a community, right? Like where everyone joins the same group, everybody is able to communicate and so on. Then the cool thing about that is you can imagine the star having its associated, it owns a bunch of NFTs of a certain type, it has a certain description, and it has a legacy of hosting certain community affordances, whether it's
Hmm.
just, communication channels, but it could also be actual software, right? And so then
Yeah.
that thing as an asset actually accrues quite a lot of value, right?
I
Like,
think in order to do this, people are just gonna have to make the jump to like making apps that like artificially limit stars to being able to do that, which is something that hasn't really been done to this point. Like there's been this distinction in apps of like the planets, stars, galaxies are one thing, comets are another, maybe
yeah,
moons are another, and have different meaning. But there's like no rule against having individual, very influential apps that make star like like sort of account or like they do the same for galaxies. Although
you could make that.
those are so rare that yeah,
You
you
can make it
absolutely
more of a
could. Like, and
convention.
this is
I mean, the other thing that stars and galaxies do, which is probably more in line with just the way that like updates go out, is like the idea that like my planet hosts a bunch of software that I send to my friends. I'm like, yeah, like I guess, like you can kind of do that. Like you can do that. Yeah, obviously, you can do that. The system should always allow you to do
also
that.
my argument here has always been that like not always been but is now um that there aren't really like fundamental architectural reasons that stars need to have this particular infrastructural role. It's just one that could be given to them in order to like accrue value. So at that point, why limit yourself to kind of the boring means of accruing value? And like why not, like we have all these people like who, because they like just don't fundamentally like or get like humanoid status games, they're like they're like, oh yes, like of course, like I will value like the price flows, like whatever the cash flows of my star is, like it's like ISP infrastructure and do all this. Is like
Yeah,
ISP infrastructure isn't, it's a story you can sell. It's not maybe the sexiest story. It might not
sure, sure.
accrue the most value. So
Well, this
at
might be a
least
bridge to
pre.
your prior, like the other rabbit or the other, road you want to take
Mhm.
or available in your choose your own adventure
Okay.
fork, right? Which is just that like, well, let's see if I don't even know if I can summarize it exactly, but basically like
The app protocol thing.
herb, yeah, like herb is a generalized app protocol, and you have like the ability that because it is generalized, you have the ability to basically like create bespoke software for a community using that protocol. So while you can
Hmm.
register that community at the ID layer, the whole point is that you can then build something very specific to that community at the like OS protocol layer. And that like the marriage of those two things is sort of like super powerful.
Yeah.
And that the narrative around that is just sort of like maybe not developed. But anyway, I don't know if that's a fair summary of your
Well, yeah,
thinking.
yeah, yeah. That the other part of that summary is that it if Urbit successfully executes that, Urbit address space will create a new category on, like, let's call it CoinGecko, that doesn't currently exist yet, which is like app protocol token. In this case, it'll be
Yeah,
like non-fungible, but that's like whatever. We're going to enter a world at some point soon where like non-fungible things are priced and put there. The current trend of like having only fungible stuff there, I think, will go away.
yeah,
But like the point is that right now, if you look at the top whatever, like 20 of like CoinGecko. It's basically
yeah,
all the two successful layer ones
yeah,
of Bitcoin and ETH, all of the narratively competing layer ones,
yeah,
stable coins, and that's it. And then you go down and you start to get like sort of various like, you continue having stuff like that. And then you also sort of start to get these like, I guess like cash flow coins or potentially cash flow coins, which are all the current governance tokens for
yeah,
things that people use all the time, which is like
yeah,
Uniswap, Compound, like those where either they might not have cash flows turned on right now, but it's very clear that that's an option
yeah,
at some point, and that there's demand for it. Then there's like I guess like app coins, which is like
yeah,
applications that are heavily used and that gate that usage with tokens, which
yeah,
is like Filecoin,
yeah,
Chainlink, there's a few others I can think of. The Graph,
yeah,
stuff that has like heavy usage and has accrued like usually in the low billions, um, from the speculative plus like utility parts of that. And I think those are probably the closest to what urban address space is, but at the same time, they're probably closer to like they're probably more analogous to an app sitting on top of urban in the future that's heavily used, like gating its
sure.
access. And I think the like OS token just completely doesn't exist because there's no other OS
Yeah, yeah,
in this
right.
space. And so I think that there's like this dual thing of, as you said, communities have this huge need to create custom software, and we're already seeing that need exist and be underserved, even by Urban itself, because we don't have
Yep,
quite enough infra yet to do it
yep,
all. And then once that happens, there will only be one OS, and it will
yep.
accrue all like a shit ton of value to its native like token in that context. And the native token can be an NFT, which I think it will certainly be here.
Yeah, yeah. It's usually because the framing for me is all about like uh or the way when you talk about this and like I think we were talking about this previously, I keep thinking of like it's like in the late 70s people didn't understand like what the internal architecture of a PC was going to be like, and they struggled with like they're like okay like maybe we'll use the I don't remember like the 3306 chip like it can kind of do this like it can do part of your compute over here, and like they didn't totally understand that maybe you needed RAM, and they didn't understand the difference between RAM and disk exactly. They weren't like some of that stuff existed in mainframes, they couldn't figure out how to make it small, and there were all these different hacks of like different ways to figure out like maybe I need storage, but maybe I need two different types of storage. Do I need like tape storage and I also need some kind of like a disk storage? And like
People
I
people
think
always
of
have like people always have a really hard time understanding new things that are built out of old things that they understand, because usually it's the case that like if they were sufficiently if either someone told them how those old things were going to be combined, or if they were sort of
yeah,
sufficiently first principle thinking enough and good at it enough, which is both really hard. I don't even know if I'm good at it, like good enough to do that, they could probably come up with something on the right lines.
hmm,
And but instead what they always do is they always try to find analogies. And the problem with analogies is that they're based on the current combinations of those things. And so you're always trying to like cast about for what in the current world is like this new thing. And so the analogy actually forces you to ignore the underlying parts and destroys your ability to think of it from first principles, when in fact you could probably put together stuff like fairly, you could at least get directionally close if you like understood like what you had in
Oh,
your
right, yeah.
hands.
Well, right. So, I mean, my point is though that like when I look at like to me, like you look at like you're like our our payments and contracts and different protocols for other pieces of our networked compute. So whether it's storage, metadata, like are these all part of the future of computing? Yeah, somehow they're part of the future of computing. But you know what's really valuable? Bringing them all together and making them
Computing
useful. Like, yeah.
in some sort of system that lets them operate together.
Yeah, yeah. So like I think that's like a but that's a hard, yeah, it's like a hard and sort of squishy and weird problem because it's this marriage of like you've got to figure out how to bring all those component parts together, right? So there's a
It's
technical
not
problem of
it's
getting.
not it's not hard it's not hard and squishy at all from a narrative perspective. Like it's really
Oh yeah,
straightforward.
yeah.
It's
Yeah, I mean in
it's
practice of
like
actually doing it.
no. I
Uh,
mean, well, no, but I mean, even in practice, like I don't think we should
let me
like
see. Yeah, yeah,
sell
that's fine.
Urbit short. It's making consistent progress towards that, and it just turns out that it takes uh, orders of magnitude more time to build a networked operating system with all the affordances that needs than a
Yeah,
non-networked operating. Not like Unix was
yeah,
built insanely fast, and like the base structure for that has like stayed extremely similar, and
yeah,
Urbit has taken longer with more talent working on it. And it's not that Urbit went down a dumb dead end. It's just that
yeah,
it actually hasn't gone down that many dead ends and has just sort of steadily progressed because like the problem takes longer. So when I say
yeah.
it's not squishy, this is like the roadmap talking point we were thinking of doing at the beginning, where we were like going to talk about maybe where Urbit goes the next few
Sure.
years.
Yeah,
And I would just start it from the point at least of um, a lot of the pieces are all like are already there, and there's pretty clear paths towards most of the pieces that we don't have, as you've said, with just needing capital. So I don't know. I think the only thing that's like squishy here is just that we're like bad at talking about it. Like we should just say we're like we're making an operating system that does all this stuff. It's making steady progress. Here's like the next year of things that are going to happen, and you know
yeah,
if you're technically inclined enough, you can understand that. And also,
yeah,
by the way, if you can, if the operating system currently has the things that you need, then like that's great and you can use it. If like you can see it will have the things you need in a year, then extrapolate that. But just imagine what number of people use that for a large number of tasks, and
yeah,
also what the value accrual is if it has like a native token that can be monetized in like a number of ways. And it's pretty
yeah,
clear at that point that you have a completely new category that you want to accumulate a lot of.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what we've been, yeah, what I've been trying to like sort of crystallize since probably really like after assembly and but more so in the beginning of this year, right? To make sure that TLON is like thinking about that as clearly as possible and sort of working on the highest leverage like like points to make it possible for the way I think about it is basically that like for an operating system to succeed, you need a feedback loop between like users and developers. So you have to prove out an initial use case with a
Mm-hmm.
simple suite of tools of some kind that brings a group of like brings some community of people to use this thing. And then once that community
Mm-hmm.
is there, and so long as the system doesn't completely suck, then developers actually have something that they can, that they can address, like people that they can ship software to. And in the process of shipping
Mm-hmm.
software, they expand that user base out because they are exploring new verticals.
I mean,
Um,
on this line of like reasoning, the very obvious product that Urbit should have, but it doesn't, is like some kind of like uh code, like sort of basically GitHub, like code collaborator,
yeah, yeah,
like collaborator editor. Just because like the main use case of Urbit right now is people building Urbit. That's
yeah,
broadening out somewhat, but it's
yeah,
still pretty true. No, which is not. It's not like feudally circular. It's actually
yeah,
extremely
yeah, I understand.
productive, and
Yeah,
has been.
no,
But like that's the main killer use case for the last 2 years.
hmm
Um, and or building Urbit and ancillary things on top of it, and like doing the ecosystem. And like the main thing missing from it is there's just a few places where you have to context switch out. So Urbit, probably I would say Urbit native calendar and Urbit native code productivity
I
would
mean, you still have,
get.
dude, the worst thing right now is just getting on Urbit. So the first thing that we're working on is just because I do think that what's come out of it's fun to build Urbit is also like there are communities that live on Urbit that are not Urbit related that have kind of sprouted out
Mhm.
from the core community. And the thing that gates that ability for the sort of like it for Urbit to just grow sort of graph wise, right? Like to hop outwards
Mhm.
through people's friends is that getting on the network. Well, it's like, okay, port, okay, well, dude, the user experience there so
It's
bad.
bad. Yeah.
And there's a lot of low hanging fruit, there's a lot of stuff and that's super important. And then if even once you boot, like, we're basically like reworking landscape from the ground up because once you get in there, like those component part, like what do you see and how do you use it and what is what is the quality of user experience there for someone who's just been invited in to hang out with my friends and then can I go fork off and start something else? That needs to be, it doesn't need to be
Mhm.
perfect, but it needs to be like serviceable and it needs to be better than what it was. I think that you're right that it's funny. We've thought about there's a bunch of infrastructure level work that will support some of the stuff you're talking about how people collaborate and
I'm
build software.
I'm
But
less
it
making
feels
I'm less making a case for a specific product, although I'm also making a case for a specific product, but I'm more saying that like if you have like a thesis about who is using Urbit,
yeah,
you always want to look at like whether there's like just a thing that would like just turbocharge that for like that specific one,
yeah,
uh, for that
that's
group, for the
interesting.
large group. But I
Yeah,
think like on the community side, I guess this is something else we could talk about, which is what do you think there is to learn right now from how NFT communities, which do things backwards and are basically just like buy this and now
yeah,
buy this and put in various forms of effort, and now you're
yeah,
in the community, and like now you're in the
yeah.
community. Um, what do you think there is to learn from that, from the Urbit side? Because it seems like they very much don't take the tack of like buy this NFT and now you can go use it to like start your own communities. It's very much like you buy it and now you have like a home online, like the.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing that we don't do that seems to be like there's a relatively like baroque and my observations are pretty naive honestly like just spending a little
Mhm.
bit of time perusing what's going on out there it's pretty rich like that people have come up with a lot of different mechanics for how you sort of like get access to different types of things and through different types of effort and it's actually kind of it seems like people are having fun with this and the thing I've been thinking about is how you can make that more like materialize that more inside of Urbit itself, right? So like, could you
Mhm.
let people create arbitrary mechanics by which you would get access to a group? So for example, say only let planets under my star get access, but actually also this star and then this star. So you can like create federations
Right.
of like things like that would be really cool. Or just payment gating. So say you have to hold a balance of this token to get into this group, or and anyway, you could imagine creating the ability for someone to combine rules like this so that you can basically have this marriage between we have the address space as this ownership token and then ways that you can basically customize access to
I
things, which
mean, without like, plugging my own shit too much, I mean, this is like what's become a lot of the inspiration for doing Ukbar, which is basically just having like a scene, because like everything you're talking, a lot of what you're talking about requires some form of like global consensus. Not all of
yeah,
it, but like,
yeah,
things relating to money or assets definitely do. Either read only or ideally dynamic, where you can like update it.
yeah,
And so we're just trying to basically bring like top level, secure premium assets and recording ability into the Urbit context where you can have fun programming them as
yeah,
opposed to the current, like, people complain about solidity and stuff, but like most of the crappiness of current Web3 programming comes from the fact that like it makes normal industrial programming look coherent and sane. Like you have to put together, I feel bad. Like you have to put together so many disparate pieces to make an app like that.
yeah.
Like just don't. I mean, there's so much gluing and context switching. That's like 90% of someone's work. And so I think
In
once we
industrial, in like
also,
conventional software, basically, you're saying, right?
yeah, in conventional
Yeah,
software, it's like, maybe you can mostly work in one language along with some network or auth stuff that you kind of routinized into your day-to-day thing, plus some
yeah,
database, and then maybe you have a DevOps team, or maybe you've learned DevOps yourself. And those
yeah,
are your like workflows, and like they're kind of, it's still a lot to put together, and it's not that fun. But like,
yeah.
yeah, Web3 is like just these like really disparate parts, like sort of JavaScript hits like smart contracts, hits like
Oh,
four
sure.
different network tools that have to talk.
Yeah,
And so I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it's a big value prop for Urbit if we can provide a unified programming experience,
That's
like
interesting. Yeah.
for hitting
I've
that
always
stuff.
thought about, I'm happy to talk about Uqbar stuff. Like, I've always thought about Uqbar in the same context because I'm like, I've always thought about it like, okay, let's say, you know, if within a group you want to like, and I don't mean necessarily like a group in the landscape sense, but just like there's
Sure,
some,
sure,
you know,
sure.
ring of nodes, and
Right.
you want to have consensus among those nodes, right? And you don't necessarily need that consensus to be shared outside of those nodes. So I want to be able to rapidly create a contract of some kind or something that we like agree to consensus compute on, like
hmm
quickly and like to reason clearly about its security model. I'm
hmm
like, well, I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm going to use Cosmos for that, or something, you know. But then I'm like, oh, like doing this native to Urbit is
The
amazing because you have it like proximal to the compute to that computing environment.
that same reasoning applies to like everything that people want to do in Web3, and like essentially it applies to like arbitrary amounts of asset orchestration, which is all like
Interesting,
that a Web3 app is.
right?
And so yeah, we need to make that happen.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because you're saying like then you also have this you're where you're actually inter. So I've always made this argument, right? And this is kind of what you were saying before. If you think of like it's like you have whatever uh, BTC, ETH, and then like whatever like earning protocols and computing protocols.
Sure,
I'm
sure.
like, yeah, well, where do you interact with these things from? Like, what do you actually, how do you call to them? Like, what, I just literally using MetaMask in my browser, like for the next 20 years? Like, forget it. It's like, that's not going to happen. Or it just sucks.
This is what I'm getting at is that it sucks. Again, as we were talking about earlier with product market fit, there's good enough product market fit and strong enough demand for doing this stuff that people
Right,
will use it, even though it
right,
sucks. And
right,
so the
right.
thing you always do in that situation is you say like, "Oh, sweet, everyone loves this, even though it sucks. Let's like make it suck less and have
Sure.
more power." Which is basically bringing everything that's currently done with MetaMask. And essentially, it's really simple to say. Basically, the direction that rollups have gone
Yeah,
um, gives the ability to create new execution environments while keeping the same base assets and
yeah,
consensus of like let's say ETH. And
yeah,
so, given that, it's highly unlikely that the optimal execution environment is like for that is like Solidity plus then lots of stitched together apps. It's much more
yeah,
likely like one language running for blockchain contracts, for apps, for
yeah,
everything in the system level, for
yeah, yeah,
databases, everything like that. And that should be, the only current contender for that is Hoon. And
yeah,
so we are making an execution environment to do blockchain contracts in
right.
Hoon because then that extends to like all this other stuff.
Yeah, it does
That's the
feel like a,
argument.
yeah, that makes sense. That's nice. That makes sense. Um,
It's actually
That's
very
like helpful
similar
to me
to
too. It's like
yeah,
I
yeah,
have like
yeah. I mean,
understood this, right? Like I'm like I think I understand this, and it's clear to me in my head, but I haven't had that. That's like a nice way of that's like a nice way to
I
describe it.
mean,
This makes sense.
our narrative, like definitely evolved as we found that we could like get closer and closer to Urbit's core value propositions for what we wanted to do. So I think
Right.
initially we were thinking about just
Well, this is somewhat
Urbit's
technical
sort of
too, right? Because I feel like you realize, oh, we could potentially do this in this native, like where you're compiling knock and then using that compiled knock as your kind of like
yeah,
core consensus. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So and
It's
I
pretty
think
cool.
that's like well, and like I think we started more from like let's use Urbit's networking abilities and use that to like try to create some, you know, interesting coordination. And then once we
Right.
found that we could like really kind of get even closer to the heart of Urbit and be like, no, the real thing here is that you get to use knock for everything and all your applications. It's essentially like the whole thing of like Node.js letting front end developers write the same thing on the back end and front end,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how
Yeah.
much it's that on like mega steroids because it applies to your entire operating system, all your
Right.
blockchain operations, all your
Right.
like indexing operations on that blockchain. And so once we figured that out, and also the fact that like things were evolving rapidly in this direction where a lot of competition was going to be on what execute like right now a lot of the competition in sort of roll up land on ETH
Yeah.
is what will execute on the second layer because it
Yeah.
completely opens up the design space to be like do you want to do the optimistic roll up approach, which is generally the idea is like let's keep using the EVM so we can port
Yeah.
stuff over and have it just work there, just cool, it works. The Starknet approach is let's make our own completely new simple language for smart contracts and have people do that. And I think all of that stuff is cool, but my approach is let's figure out what if we're talking about like, networked applications at scale for like, the future OS, what language will that be written in? What will its execution environment be? That's obviously Hoon. And so at that point, we want to make our as little impedance mismatch with
Right.
the blockchain environment as possible. And thanks to like, the advances in mostly in ZK technology and also sort of roll up research, um, which could eventually transition to an L1, um, that's all doable. And so
Right.
essentially, we're in this place where suddenly, out of nowhere, in the not too distant past, it's gone from like impractical and weird to like very, very possible and mostly a matter of productionizing to be able
Yeah.
to let you run smart contracts in Hoon that then let you make APIs that let you, instead of having smart contracts be this weird extra part of your app, let it be an
Right.
integral part of it, which then
Right.
opens
Right.
up all the stuff you were talking about with
Yeah.
communities
Yeah. Yeah.
wanting to
Yeah.
like spin off one-off use cases for consensus. And so we'll keep doing the big financial and like sort of, whatever, the big juicy use
Yeah.
cases. But
Yeah.
also there'll be all these like micro use cases that emerge.
Do you not think that those like larger, so yeah, so then how in that future do you think about like the existent, kind of like dominant L1s basically, right? Because like
Yeah, the two like basically right now things could change. I think Bitcoin is completely screwed, and I've like divested of it because like this roll-ups have like Bitcoin and ETH both agree that you need to have functioning layer twos.
yeah,
Um, Bitcoin's only answer there has been Lightning, which is like I've gone more in depth than most people in
yeah,
terms of like knowing the protocol and programming it. Um, it has one very limited use case that to a large degree can be replicated in these other things, and I think ETH has demonstrated like, extreme product market fit for like settlement, both for like NFTs,
mhm,
trading, lending, what have you. And Bitcoin doesn't have the technical capability to support that. It would have to make significant changes in the base layer, which are technically very possible. I think culturally very unlikely.
yeah,
And so I think because of that, and there's no other L1 right now that's remotely close to sort of smart contract base layer that's remotely close to ETH in terms
hmm
of having a base asset that's accrued a ton of value already, that
hmm
has good prospects for continuing to do so, that people want to spend money on. People want
hmm
to like spend much more money to run transactions on ETH.
hmm
So I think that the path for us in that world is uh, mostly like assume ETH will initially win. At the very least, we can't write the kind of contracts we need on Bitcoin, and we don't want it's dumb to do it
hmm
on another L1. And then in the future, if we accrue enough economic value, we can look at we sort of maintain the option of moving out to our own L1. Although I think people are gonna start to realize that there's like a lot of economic value that can be taught like captured in like the winning execution environment roll ups. So probably we'll just go after that first because it's like it's kind
Sure.
of like your thing where I just want to like deliver stuff that people can actually use in order to iterate
Yeah,
rather than like having this like pie in the sky thing that like
yeah,
which is fine. And of course some people have become extremely wealthy by selling those things to people, but the
yeah.
problem is you have to be willing to like just like kind of sell the vapor for years and hope you can materialize it into something, and that's less like fun and motivating. And yeah, personally it's just harder for me to do.
You're not inspired by the by Luna and their great
That's,
success?
yeah, I mean there's I mean the real grift here is like being Cardano, like you like they realize
Yeah.
like Luna made the mistake of like having a product that people were like putting money into. As long as you just don't have anything at all, you can keep the billions.
Uh, uh,
Well,
I
nothing
like
at all
the
except
other.
like an army of bag holders and YouTube influencers. Like the true, that's like the real
Yeah,
blockchain
that's
was the YouTube influencers we bought along the way.
yeah, yeah. Well, I guess we're doing that right now. Um,
Yeah, exactly. So like yeah, so but it's like this. Yeah, just to sum up everything, basically like I think that it's really underappreciated how big a deal it is to unify all computing into one environment, and
yeah,
not
yeah.
just like as much as possible, and not just like okay, we have. To me, it feels insane to have a roadmap that's like we have Urbit. It's one of its biggest use cases is these sort of like crypto adjacent communities or letting communities do anything we want here, and then we force them to like do the execution part in some other language or environment. That's complete
Sure.
insanity and is going to like hurt adoption. It won't feel painful initially, but in 2 years it will seem like bad.
Wait. What are you referring to exactly? Like,
If we don't have the ability to do something like UFAR, where you can write
oh, got it.
contracts
Yes.
in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
same
yeah, yeah,
environment, it's gonna
yeah,
everyone's gonna like keep straining against that for years, and it's just constantly gonna be this source of
yeah.
friction. That
We
think of it
skipped
as
the
like
Yeah. So I think of so you're skipping things that we understand that others
okay, I
may
understand.
not, right? Right. Right. Like, but it's like, yes, I think of TLON's primary, like our kind of main goal, right, is get crypto adjacent communities, which I think of as some
Yeah,
overlap between like every MetaMask user and every Signal user, whatever, there's some overlap there, and then maybe expanding out slightly. Like,
I personally think Signal users aren't gonna make it and like will adopt Urbit, but that's a whole different like thing. Or
I
the
just
people who
think
are
of
on
it
that
like
part of
the
the Venn
ethos of
diagram.
there's some, yeah, some, whatever, there's some overlap
Oh, I
there.
want to go. I want to go off on privacy, bros. I want to like do.
Well,
No, no, no.
no,
I want
no.
to.
What's here? Okay, this is a fine route.
Okay,
What's
I want
interesting
to hear it.
about Signal is that so the hardcore Signal users, it's a that's a whole. I'm not even like it's that's a
Okay.
whole thing. I don't even know if I understand completely, right? Like there are certain
Sure.
people who have very severe threat model. Like if you're Snowden, that's a whole different issue. Like if you're someone who wishes they were Snowden but don't actually have that threat model, yes, I'm like, okay, that's
Right.
a psychosis I can't totally understand. But I think that privacy is important. And what I'm more interested in is like, for example, all the parents at my son's preschool a while ago used Signal, and they were like adamant about using Signal for anything to communicate around their kids. Obviously, do they need the privacy guarantees of Signal? No, but it's like it felt good.
Wait. So
Like
they
it,
think their kids are gonna like
I
violate their
think they,
privacy, or like
oh,
these
no,
are
no,
like
they
really
just didn't
like
want to
swinging
put
parents, or
they didn't want no, they didn't want to put any information about their families on centralized platforms that they felt like could be spied on.
okay, okay,
Which
fair enough. I
that
got it.
that I like. I love
It's
that. I love that.
understandable.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
Like it makes sense. And so I'm interested in those people generally, right? And there is this. I feel like I have these conversations often where there's just this, and they're more and more common. It's like at the grocery store or like I was talking to a gardener the other day who was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, think of it like we build an OS that lives in the cloud that you actually own. And he was like, man, we need that. Like, just like, just immediately, I was like,
Right. Right.
yeah, you're right. We do need that. Anyway, so I think of like our primary use case is give people great communication tooling that actually belongs to them, and then let developers like very easily ship software to this like
Yep.
this
Yep. Yep.
meta set of communities that we provide a good suite of tooling for. And then what you're saying is that as those community use cases grow in their variety, a lot of what's going to make them interesting is their ability to actually transact together, create contracts together, do blockchainy things together. And if you're always calling out to some other system, like that's just not a good enough experience. You're going to have something that's native
It's
to
not
the
a good
system.
enough developer experience, and so like people are always
Yeah,
going to be like, oh yeah, you like totally could do this on Urbit, but like no one does it because like, oh, you could do
yeah.
it in this, which is actually what we have right
Hmm.
now.
Yeah, no, it already, I mean, if you think about how much it sucks to like mirror Azimuth back into the system. Like it works, but it works, but it's clunky. And there are a bunch of
Hmm.
so my broader argument of all, which has always been like, look, like I've for a while felt like, oh, every dApp should be a landscape app. Like, why would I want it? Like the model of I have this standalone thing that I have to authenticate with my browser. It knows nothing about me, has none of my state. It can't persist any of my state. It can't do computation. It's just like kneecapped programming environment. It doesn't make any sense. I'm like, cool, run that on Urbit. But then when I thought about, okay, well, then you still
It's
have to authenticate with that thing. You still have to call back to the blockchain.
right.
That's not
Yep.
great. Like, it would be cool if you could fix that too. So anyway, that like,
Yeah. I mean, this is roughly what we're trying to fix, and I think people, in the industry could come up with a lot of other things that are annoying there
sure.
related to like picking up past events and indexing. It's just like none of it is like that hard individually. It's just a lot of like JS munging and going across boundaries and like just like I
Well,
think we'll
you
be
know what's interesting to think
surprised.
about? Like the thing is the developer profile for a lot of this stuff, which I actually really like, and you see this with sort of dApp world as well as like sort of emergent developer world in Urbit, which is like these people are in fact kind of like weekend warrior developers or whatever. Like they're people who are just for fun making stuff like for their friends as
Yeah,
a side project, which is like, yeah, that's what programming is all about. Like it's supposed to be fun, right? But for people like that,
yeah,
like it has to be easy because you just don't have that much time. It's not a job. And there are ways in which I do think people will sell software
It
over Urbit, and
it
that'll
has to
become an
be
industry. But
easy, and it has to not have lots of like implicit know-how that
yeah,
that you can't get anywhere and that like trips you up if you don't have it. Which is probably
yeah, I
what's
feel like no
frustrating
one,
about the current developer experience on Urbit, which is that there is still a lot of
right.
implicit know-how that you have
Well,
to
yeah,
do stuff.
exactly. Like I think it's like when I think of like why does anyone like learn to build like a Node app? It's like, I mean, somewhere in their future they imagine themselves making money doing it, right? Like that's why you put up with
Sure.
that complexity.
They imagine themselves having fun doing it, or they imagine being able to make something kind of a little bit more interesting for their, for their friends, where it has like those various like components or whatever.
Maybe it's
Yeah,
true. I don't know. I mean, I do want
but yeah,
people to make money building software on Urbit, and I do think they will. So I think that's an important like these things are.
that hasn't really been a problem. That hasn't really been a problem today. Most of the good Hoon programmers are like employed writing Hoon,
Yeah, that's
and
true.
there's
But I
like
think that
there's additional capacity for more, and that'll increase further.
well, just in terms of my kind of like users and developers feedback loop, right? You're like you have people using this thing, and then developers are building things to extend that suite of uses. Like I do
Mm.
think you want there to exist some economic incentive there, where it's like developers should be able to sell software directly to people over the network, which you can easily imagine that being a
You could,
being an
yeah.
affordance. And I think
I mean,
that's a
right
good way
now,
to make that.
to be perfectly frank, right now though, I think for a good period of time going forward, I think that all of the, let's call them good developers in Hoon are going to get like snatched up by organizations around the network that have like raised money and need like people. And I think like TLON still has like excess capacity to absorb. We still have some to absorb. A few others
Yeah,
do. New ones will get started. There's some that are like already started that will like create further capacity by having stuff. And like
yeah,
what's going to happen is that like the $10 a download you can make doing that is going to get dwarfed by your like $250,000 job offer.
maybe true. Yeah, or you can like uh, you can go and raise money yourself, right? Which you've also seen.
That's
Uh,
also
yeah,
true. So like I think there's like, and that's also gonna happen. So I think that we might just be at this like rapid expansion phase of Urbit where like the limits are mostly capital and developers, but like once the
yeah,
capital's there, it's just gonna soak up a lot of uh sort of as many good developers as we can produce for a while. I think is pretty likely.
yeah. That tracks. That's how this stuff normally goes,
Which
I
is
think.
honestly
Yeah,
like great. Like
yeah,
that's
yeah.
also
It's fine.
like on its own like another really good motivation for people to get into stuff. And I think the motivation isn't like specifically that they can make money, but that they can make
Yeah.
money having fun.
Yeah,
That's
well,
like
that's
really
what I
important.
mean. That's maybe that's what it's funny. Yeah, I was just thinking like I feel like the reason why it would be amazing to be able to let people charge for like I love this, not like just because I genuinely love it. Like you create a group of friends, like you create a group, you invite all your friends there, you're all hanging out, and then you're like, oh, I want to build something that whatever, like collects all the, it's like rumors or whatever, right? It's like I'm going to build
Hmm.
like a pseudonymous or like an anonymous little chat app that only we can use, right? That I'm only
Right.
going to
Yeah.
share with this group of people. Like
Hmm.
that is so cool. Like it's so fun.
It
Like it
is. It
actually
is.
like
And I think
brings
that
back like the
will.
joy of computing. But then you take that a little further and you're like, oh, actually I'm going to build a group where you pay a little bit to get in, and then there's like, and then I can, and I part of your payment is you get access to that app or something like that. Like that also, there's
I think we
something
haven't
sweet about it.
explored paid groups and token gated groups and
Yeah,
complex NFT gated groups because we haven't had
yeah,
the infrastructure. And I think once
yeah,
we do, we probably will start plugging some of those energy leaks we've talked about, and people
yeah,
will be
yeah,
like providing value, but they'll
yeah.
also be capturing it. And so once they're capturing that value and that money, then they can also spend it on Urbit or like
Right.
create.
Yeah, yeah,
There's a lot of stuff, the good things that happen then. Other
yeah.
people, all right, I'm gonna like I have to like head off pretty soon. It's
Oh
not
yeah,
due to
let's call it.
boredom
It's
either,
fine.
but like
No, no,
yeah,
that's good because actually we didn't
let's
go
call it
down your
there with that.
energy leaks rabbit hole. We can go. We can do
We
this
like I
again.
think we like
Eh,
indirectly hit enough of it that it might be
all right.
boring, but like
Okay.
yeah, I think we're
All
doing
right.
good.
I'll let
All
you get
right,
back to your palazzo.
yeah, all
At
right,
least
sounds
that's
good.
what it looks like.
Literally, that's well, that's the idea. Yeah,
Uh,
the metaverse.
thanks
Um,
for doing.